Become a sustaining member of the Commonwealth Club for just $10 a month. Join today.
Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to tonight's virtual Commonwealth Club program. Obviously, we wish we could be with you in person, but I am thrilled to be with you tonight. My name is Erin Haynes. I'm editor-at-large for The 19th and also a founding mother. The 19th is a nonprofit independent newsroom that is focused on the intersection of gender, politics, and policy. As the club continues to host virtual events, they are also grateful for the continued support of their members and donors. You can visit commonwealthclub.org to learn more about membership, or you can support the club right now with a tax-deductible gift by clicking the blue donate button that's on your screen. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Adam Serwer, staff writer at The Atlantic and author of The Cruelty is the Point, The Past, Present, and Future of Trump's America. Adam is an award-winning journalist, and his new book chronicles the Trump administration, exploring a number of issues, including white nationalism and the devastating impact that fear and exclusion has had on our democracy. So as just a reminder, we're going to take your questions. So please submit those in the chat. And with that, Adam, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for doing this, Erin.
You are very, very welcome. I want to get right into our conversation. And I think probably a good place to start is something that you and I have talked about a lot. For those of you tuning in, I will tell you that Adam and I are friends, and we have talked a lot about The Cruelty is the Point and a lot of the work that ended up in this book kind of along the way. And you were, I was surprised to learn reading this book that you were among the political press that was kind of initially skeptical about President Trump's chances. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the moment that you realized or that you became convinced that Donald Trump could actually become president of the United States.
So I'm not sure that there was a particular moment where I became convinced. I understood it as a possibility. Certainly when he started winning the actual formal nominations contest, that was a line that was crossed that was distinct from, what had until that point been. I think some people had treated it like it was sort of a sideshow to the actual election, or that he was going to implode, which was a pattern that would repeat itself, obviously, throughout the administration. This belief that Donald Trump had finally crossed the line that would, divest him from his supporters. And that, but even though I wasn't sure that he was really going to win, and, the polling suggested that he would not, even until the end, although his chances were better than most people acknowledged at the time. It was clear to me that he was manipulating some of the most treacherous forces in American history. And he was doing so without regard for the damage that might cause. And that to me was already interesting because it said that there was political strength in wielding those forces against some of the most vulnerable people in the country. And that was going to have an impact no matter what. So I immediately began sort of reading about the history of American nativism, American immigration politics, in particular the history of Reconstruction, which I think is really a sort of seminal struggle in American history. It's the first time that America attempts to become a full multiracial democracy, and it fails. And the reasons why it fails are also the reasons why it's failed ever since, or why it's struggled ever since to meet those ideals. So even though I was never, certain, I wasn't one of those people who had sort of, a certainty that he would win. Enough people that I knew who were astute observers of American politics did think he would win, or did think he had a chance, as I write in the book. And so that was enough for me to take it seriously from the beginning.
Yeah. And I think too, you and I are journalists that believe in the value of history as, the foundation, the context for, a lot of the work that we do. And so you realized that as part of your reporting kind of along the way to covering that campaign, to covering this administration, was really a robust and working knowledge of the history of this country, of the history of American politics. Talk about whether that was something that you had an appreciation for even before you came to this, to covering and writing about this administration, and if that's something that you feel like you have come to rely on even more in the past 5 years, I guess I would say.
So I would say that the sort of style that I have brought to my work began really in Ferguson. And I think a lot of this reevaluation of American history begins in Ferguson, because Ferguson, I think, is a seminal moment in the Obama administration when a lot of Americans really begin asking themselves, how is it that American life is still so defined by race when we have a Black president? How could this paradox exist? And so people start looking back at history to try and understand, things like the massacre in Charleston, the rise of Donald Trump sort of accelerated this process. But I think, even earlier than that, when I was working at Mother Jones, my editor there, David Corn, he said to me, the news is what people have forgotten. It's not just what people don't know yet. And I think that's important because, in journalism, there's an obvious ideological reason to privilege new knowledge over past knowledge. But sometimes readers don't have the full context for why something is happening. And sometimes reporters, especially if you're on a beat, you've been covering something for a long time, you can miss. You can have contextual information that you don't think you need to communicate to a reader that, in fact, would illuminate the issue for them greatly. And so, for me, this sort of looking into history to find the origin of struggles that we're dealing with in the present day has been my way of illuminating for readers something that they might not quite understand, in part because of the nature of journalism itself, which is very forward-looking.
Yeah. Yeah. And in contrast to, our society, our democracy, which tends to be cyclical. Right. And so that's a really good point that you're making. I have to, for folks who are tuning in here, I have to read the section because I thought that stood out to me. The quote that you mentioned from David Corn, our friend. So I'll just read this, a little passage from this, if you will indulge me for a second. Reporters are often taught that journalism is the first draft of history, but American journalism is afflicted by a presentism, a kind of goldfish memory that struggles to think outside the present or recent past. That makes a certain amount of sense. The old chestnut is that the news is what is new. But an old editor of mine, David Corn of Mother Jones, used to say that the news is also what people have forgotten. The reactions to Trump, whether the enthusiasm or apprehension on the right or the disbelief on the left, showed that Americans had forgotten quite a bit. And I have spent the last 5 years trying to help people remember. So, yeah, we talk about kind of how journalism is forward looking. What is it that the American people forgot in the 2016 election? And maybe even, 70 million people forgot again in 2020.
I think that there is a kind of, I refer to this in the book as accidents of liberal optimism and conservative sentimentality. And by that, I simply mean, when Barack Obama says the arc of history bends towards justice, that's a very compelling image, but it's not really how history works in practice. A lot of times it's one step forward, two steps back, or two steps forward, one step back. When you look at someone like Donald Trump, he is operating from a very idealized version of history. When he says "Make America Great Again," that raises a question of when was America great and what period are you talking about?
And for whom?
And for whom? And when you see things like the 1776 Project, which was an official state history as retort to the New York Times 1619 Project, that is not about exploring history. That is about putting forth an official historical narrative that sentimentalizes these aspects of American history that conservatives would rather marginalize or not see for what they are. And I think, to a certain extent, the sort of traditional liberal narrative for political reasons emphasizes American progress. And sometimes that narrative is not as neat as presented, because politically it does not make sense to talk about the warts in that narrative or the way in which it might not be accurate. And so, and I understand that politicians, their job is to get elected. It's not to tell the truth. That's our job. So, when they say things that aren't true, it's our job to point out the ways in which they are not true. And for me, there's two sides of this American story about us always moving forward, which is, one denies, one assumes that we are constantly moving forward, and the other denies that we had anything to overcome at all. And I think that both of those really do a disservice to Americans understanding their own country.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you talk in the book about those who lack the knowledge to separate history from sentiment. I mean, I'm based in Philadelphia, where probably our most powerful and potent origin stories, can be found, about, from our founding documents to the founding fathers, you name it. And these are, there certainly is truth in those, but a truth that people would rather gravitate to, as opposed to exactly some of those realities that you point out that are, uncomfortable for some folks at the very least, and wanting to kind of relegate those more uncomfortable, ugly parts of our country to past behavior, as opposed to, a legacy that is living and breathing and still very much with us and very much impacting many people, many millions of people in this country. I
think there's a reason for that. I mean, I think, sorry, I was just going to say, this conversation about the past has political salience. I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence that you're looking in some of these states, conservative legislatures trying to restrict the teaching of certain aspects of American history having to do with race. Because if you look at American history and you determine that present day racial disparities are in large part the product of American public policy, that, it doesn't inherently, but it makes a strong case for state intervention to rectify those disparities. And if you don't want the state to intervene, then you want to find some way of arguing that those disparities are the result of inherent differences in talent or ability or culture or having nothing to do with actions of the state that must be rectified. And to a large extent, I think that is what this argument over history that we're having is really about.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I feel like that should have been one of the lessons that we have learned in the past 4 years. And yet, the way that, frankly, I think a lot of the coverage is happening does not necessarily reflect that we have learned that lesson. I mean, I think, one of the things that I'd love to ask political journalists that I know, and I will ask it to you now, is either why do you think that Trump won in 2016, or why do you think that Hillary lost? And, one of the answers that people love to give, you mentioned in the book, economic anxiety, right, was the reason that Trump was elected in 2016. But if people do not give answers that have something to do with either race or gender, like within their first three answers, I'm always skeptical about whether they actually understand the dynamics of this country, the dynamics of that election, the dynamics of this past election.
I think it's really important to distinguish between a legitimate grievance and a legitimate means of addressing that grievance. So, the Obama stimulus was too small. We know that now. The Obama administration did not do a good job of keeping people in their homes. A substantial amount, particularly of Black and Latino wealth, was wiped out as a result of the housing crisis. But a lot of white people were hurt too. But the distinction is that the overwhelming majority of those Black and Latino voters were negatively impacted by the recession and the Obama administration's failure to address it more aggressively. They were largely immune to Trump's appeals. And so we have to ask the question about, it's not simply enough to say economic hardship makes you react a certain way. What makes you react a certain way is the ideological lens through which you experience your personal hardship. And that, it's not simply enough to say, if you have if you experience some misfortune, you are automatically, you're automatically going to find appealing a candidate who advertises his willingness to use state violence against religious and ethnic minorities in the United States. You're automatically going to find that appealing. That there's a missing step there. That for a lot of reasons, commercial, ideological, social, I think in 2016, a lot of reporters were loath to admit. But I think Trump, over the past, 4 years of his administration, made it very difficult to avoid the conclusions that most of us, or many of us, had drawn in 2015.
Yeah. And a lot of what you were able to glean, what got you to kind of, the reality that Donald Trump was going to become president, was some of what you saw on the campaign trail, right? And you talk so much in the book about not just the president, but his supporters, right? So I'm wondering if you will indulge us here and read a little bit from the book. I'm thinking about page 42. If you could read page 42, I think that this sets us up for the next part of our conversation.
Okay. Which part?
Even before Trump won.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Even before Trump won, the United States was consumed by a debate over the nature of his appeal. Was racism the driving force behind Trump's candidacy? If so, how could Americans, the vast majority of whom said they opposed racism, back a racist candidate? During the final few weeks of the campaign, I asked dozens of Trump supporters about their candidates' remarks regarding Muslims and people of color. I wanted to understand how these average Republicans, those who would never read the neo-Nazi website, The Daily Stormer, or go to a Klan rally at a Confederate statue, had nevertheless embraced someone who demonized religious and ethnic minorities. What I found was that Trump embodied his supporters' most profound beliefs, combining an insistence that discriminatory policies were necessary with vehement denials that his policies would discriminate, and absolute outrage that the question would even be asked. It was not just Trump supporters who were in denial about what they were voting for, but Americans across the political spectrum who, as had been the case with those who backed Duke, were searching desperately for any alternative explanation, outsourcing anti-Washington anger, economic anxiety to the ones staring them in the face. The frequent post-election media expeditions to Trump country to see whether the fever is broken or whether Trump's most ardent supporters have changed their minds are a direct outgrowth of this mistake. These supporters will not change their minds because this is what they always wanted: a president who embodies the rage that they feel towards those they hate and fear, while reassuring them that that rage is nothing to be ashamed of.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, and I think that that's exactly it. I mean, I think that, because President Trump was somebody who was a public figure for so long before he was president, we knew who he was. I think that, the surprise to too many political journalists was kind of who the American electorate was. And so
I think that's right.
Yeah. I mean, what is it that we missed? What is it that we are still missing about that electorate? And why does that matter?
I think, part of, I think it's complicated because I feel like this is Trump's constituency is ideally geographically distributed to maximize his support in both the Senate and the Electoral College. And the structure of that system, which allows one party to hold power without winning a majority of the votes. Trump came within a hair's breadth of winning re-election, despite winning many millions fewer votes than Joe Biden. And he won in 2016, despite having fewer votes than Hillary Clinton. A majority of Americans rejected Donald Trump in 3 straight elections. In 2018, Democrats took the House, but they did not take the Senate. They took the Senate and the White House in 2020, but they came, very close to not doing that. And so, when you have a base that is distributed that way, it becomes more urgent to persuade that base that they're on the verge of destruction. And so anything they do to prevent that destruction is justified. And so that's how you end up with this sort of apocalyptic rhetoric that has become a staple of Trump rallies, where he's sort of basically like, the liberals want to destroy everything you love. Joe Biden is going to kill God, Cory Booker is going to go after the housewives in the suburbs. I mean, you really can't get much more explicit than that. This kind of rhetoric is there to say, maybe I'm not the ideal person you would vote for, because I'm on my third marriage and I have a lot of kids or whatever, but I'm vulgar, but I'm the one who's standing between you and the end of your world as you know it. And even though that's not true, it's a very potent and effective political pitch. And one of the things that kind of political pitch does is it makes his own cruelty seem heroic, because he is merely acting in defense of traditional Americans as they understand themselves to be, and defending their inheritance of the country from people who, do not deserve to be in charge or do not deserve to hold power because they're not truly American to begin with.
Right. That was an effective strategy, at least for 4 years, right? Is enough to convince others that this is a strategy to emulate. We're seeing folks, lower down the ticket that feel like this is a path to success. Obviously, the former president still holds an outsized influence over, Republican politics in this moment. And so, I'm wondering, I know we're only 6 months into a Biden-Harris administration, but, a lot of folks are asking kind of about whether the lasting influence of Trumpism, if voters were a majority of voters ended up rejecting this, but there were, it was a slim majority that rejected it. And so, it was slim in the Electoral College, but it was a fairly large popular vote margin. I mean, to answer your question, I think, Trump highlighted the role of cruelty in American politics, but it's a false sense of comfort to think that that's all behind us, and a misinterpretation to think it started with him. It neither started nor ended with him. Is something that goes back to the founding of the country. If you're going to say that all men are created equal, you have to find justifications for why the people you own as chattel do not count, that they do not have inalienable rights, that the same inalienable rights that you do. So this politics is very old. It's not just, it's not just about the Republican Party or about conservatism. It's something that is a part of, unfortunately embedded in the history of American politics. But Trump mostly showed the Republican Party what they could get away with. And now that they know they can get away with it, I mean, as I said, in 2020, they lost, but they lost by much less than they thought they were going to lose by, in a situation where, a lot of people were predicting something like a landslide for Joe Biden. And when that didn't happen, what it said was, this Trumpism thing can work. It might even work better without him. Because what it's really about, as I said, is maximizing Republican electoral potential within the counter-majoritarian levers of American democracy. And so as long as that pays off, until they pay a significant political price for it, the Republican Party is going to continue on the same path. And they're going to keep doing things like attempt to restrict the electorate from the participation of Democratic constituencies so that they can hold power without having to worry about what those people think. Yeah, that was exactly where I was driving next. So thank you for that segue. Because, so you mentioned, politicians are, here to get elected. They're not here to tell us the truth. And obviously, we are still living with the big lie, even though it did not work for President Trump in terms of getting him a second term. It continues to be very effective in our politics, especially, at the state level, with what we're seeing in these state legislatures wanting to address the threat of election integrity, which we know is not real and not a threat. And so you talk in the book about Trump's understanding of the rigged system and how that is different from our understanding of what the rigged system is. I guess, for people, people who are working on behalf of voting rights, frame this as existential, as a threat to our democracy and everything else that comes along with it. But I mean, I wonder if you agree. I mean, that the big lie that this idea of the rigged system is dangerous, and also kind of what the stakes are of misinformation. I mean, yes, people are literally dying over misinformation of vaccines, but misinformation is literally an essential issue.
So I think there's two things that, I try to distinguish in the book between the rigged system that Bernie Sanders talks about, which is, from his view, an economic system that redistributes income upwards and denies the great mass of the American people the ability to participate or have access to American economic prosperity, which is instead hoarded by the people who are in the top 1 to 30% of the income bracket. That is distinct from Donald Trump's version of a rigged system, which is one in which the unworthy are elevated over the worthy. And you can tell who Donald Trump thinks is unworthy because he talks about them all the time and how scary they are and how they're destroying everything you and he love about America. But I think, when you look at these laws, it's not clear to me that these laws will be successful. It's clear that they are intended to restrict the participation of Democratic constituencies in politics so that Republicans can be insulated from, doing things that they don't like. So if you're a politician and you only have to worry about the most conservative segment of the electorate, it doesn't really matter how much liberals are howling about what you're doing if you have them packed into districts where they can't elect another representative, or, you're in a rural state where no matter what you do, you're going to get reelected. And so, I think we have to remember that American unfreedom always presents itself as a defense of democracy. The Confederacy presented itself as preserving the original Constitution as understood by the founders. The Democratic redeemers who overthrew the Reconstruction governments saw themselves as purifying the ballot, as protecting American democracy from the illegitimate participation of Black men. And I think you can hear something similar in this rhetoric now when they talk about, in some cases, in the more Trumpy corners of the internet and in conservative intellectual world, they talk about people who are not really American. In parts of the less Trumpy internet, you can hear them talk about how it's good to restrict the electorate because the ignorant shouldn't be participating anyway. And that's a little more of a dog whistle, but we still know what that means. And then there's Trump, who says things like, Philadelphia and Detroit should not be allowed to decide a presidential election. And that is 100% clear. Despite the fact that Trump did better in Detroit and Philadelphia in 2020 than 2016, him and his base consider those places, the political power, the Black political power that emanates from those spaces, as fundamentally illegitimate and see its restriction not as marring democracy, as most voting rights advocates do, because it attacks political equality, but defending democracy because certain people, because the country belongs to Trump's base legitimately, and anything other than their political victory is a usurpation. And so, that's a very dangerous place to be. And fundamentally, when we look at American history, the only way that parties change is if they are forced to, their means of power changes. So you look at an organization like the Democratic Party, which was, in the 1930s, the most powerful white supremacist organization in American life. Because of the entry of Black voters, because of this coalition of Black voters, labor unions, urban liberals, they fundamentally changed this party that had been presiding over a Jim Crow state in the American South, in which Black people were not allowed to participate, into a party of civil rights. So what that says to me is that as long as the Republican Party does not have to reach outside of its constituency to hold power, it will continue on this path. And changing those incentives really requires altering the system so that it's more equal. So that means admitting new states. It means maybe multi-member districts. It means protecting voting rights at the federal level so that states cannot pick and choose their electorates so that they are no longer responsive to the people. I mean, that's the fundamental function of democracy, is to have a representative democracy, is that representatives care about what their constituents think. And so they act in their interest. Now, when politicians no longer have to worry about what their constituents think, they no longer have to respect their rights or their desires. And that's short circuits the entire feedback process that is necessary for democracy to function. So I think we're in a dangerous place. I don't know that it's necessarily true that the Republican devices will work, in part because, coalitions change, politics change. It's hard to know what the future is going to be. But I think there should be no doubt about the intent of these laws, which is to insulate the Republican Party from the majority.
Yeah. And a reminder, Donald Trump was telling the big lie in 2016. It just so happened that he won. He was raising the same specter of a rigged election, of voter fraud in urban centers, but things worked out.
He said undocumented immigrants have been bussed in. Millions of undocumented immigrants have been bussed in to vote for Hillary Clinton.
And was
there was no evidence for it. Produced no evidence for it. It was a complete lie.
Yeah, and was suggesting that folks show up at the polling places, and in places like Philadelphia, his supporters show up to protect the polls.
But what's important about this is that it's a symbolic belief. What he's really, it's like birtherism. What he's really saying is these people, even if they have more votes, their votes are illegitimate. They shouldn't count. And so, it doesn't matter if they got more votes, because the votes that I got are real votes, and the votes that they got are lesser votes. They're illegitimate votes. They're the votes of people who aren't really truly American. And therefore, despite having fewer votes, I am more legitimate because I am an avatar of the real Americans.
Yeah. I want to ask you to read one more thing before I ask you one more question, and then we go to the questions that our audience has, and you all have a lot of really good ones. If you could turn to page 35 and start with I guess maybe if you just want to explain to people, you were reading Black Reconstruction by W.B. Du Bois, and you come to this quote that I want you to read, and then the quote that comes, the paragraph that comes after that.
So you want me to read from the Du Bois quote at the bottom? Mm-hmm. In his note to the reader at the introduction of Black Reconstruction, Du Bois writes, "If he believes that the Negro in America and in general is an average and ordinary human being who under given environment develops like other human beings, then he will read this story and judge it by the facts adduced. If, however, he regards the Negro as a distinctly inferior creation who can never successfully take part in modern civilization and whose emancipation and enfranchisement were gestures against nature, then he will need something more than the sort of facts that I have set down. But this latter person, I am not trying to convince." Keep going.
Just the graph right after that. Yeah.
"This was an inspiration in a dark moment. I did not set out to write this essay attempting to convince anyone of my point of view. I was simply laying down the facts as I saw them and attempting to get at the truth as best I could, so that in a different time and place, one less deferential to Trump and Trumpism, someone would be able to access the truth."
And I think a lot of journalists, especially journalists of color, that kind of was where they ended up in, at the end of the Trump era, really recognizing that, the importance of leaving behind an honest and accurate
record
of this moment, especially when, you saw just a complete lack of prioritization of facts and just outright lies kind of just dominating the landscape. We've been here before in many ways, as you write. The former president did exactly what he said that he would. And there were a lot of people who just were not listening, whether that was journalists or
I think it was electorate. I think for some people, there was a kind of double delusion where it was like there were some people who were unwilling to believe that their fellow citizens were capable of supporting a man like this. And there were people who did not believe that Trump was the man that he was. They invented a kind of alternative Trump that they could cheer for and believe in. And so, both of those groups of people could not really see him clearly. But to be honest, I feel like my depiction of Trump is, I don't feel like there's a lot of daylight between what I think Trump believes and what Trump believes he believes. I think that for the most part, the discrepancy comes when the people who defend Trump want to say that he doesn't think and say and do the things he says and thinks and does, because of how that would reflect on them. But I don't think that there's a lot of daylight in between what I think Donald Trump believes and what Donald Trump, even says that he believes.
Okay, well, that makes me want to ask one more then. And that is, if you could sit down and ask former President Trump anything, you get to go down to Mar-a-Lago and ask whatever you want about this presidency, about what he feels like his legacy is, whatever. What do you think you would ask? What would you want to know from him?
I don't have anything to ask Donald Trump. I think Donald Trump is not a particularly interesting person. And I think that this book is not really about Trump because, his appetites, his vanities, his impulses are actually quite shallow. And one of the frustrations of the past 4 years, I think, is that it was hard for people to write the same stories over and over about Trump because he's not that deep. There's a piece, that the Atlantic published, sort of towards the end of the Trump administration about this. There isn't really that much to say about Trump. There's a lot of sort of weird Kremlinology that was done, sort of trying to get inside Trump's head about what he thinks, what he's doing. Is he eating burgers at night, drinking Diet Coke, watching cable TV, enraged? And I think he's actually just not that interesting. I think the more interesting question is, why did the country choose this man? And what is it going to do now that he's gone? And that is what the book is preoccupied with. It's not preoccupied with figuring out, what Trump believes or thinks, because he has been very open about those things for people who want to hear them. And I don't think that there's anything in particular more to glean from him in terms of, he is pretty upfront. He's telling you what his values are every day. And I think, people who want to say, what is Donald Trump thinking? It's a mystery. Simply do not want to accept what he has put forth for them. Yeah.
Well, my friend, I think you may be one of the few journalists who currently has a book about this presidency that did not either seek to or end up engaging with him and to get his thoughts and to try to figure out what he was doing. So kudos to you for centering this electorate and our friends, family, neighbors, and the people that we live, work, and love alongside every single day to figure out what's going on with them and what's going on with this country. So with that, we have got a lot of questions from readers. People want to know many things about your thoughts on where we go from here. So I will start with, what will it take to reshape the thought process of the current Republican Party? So kind of to your point about the electorate and where we go from here.
I think that is a very complicated question. And I think to some extent, it's not really something liberals can do or Democrats can do. The identity of the Republican Party is a Republican and conservative project. And I think, all the Democratic Party can do is provide competition and extract a political price for a certain kind of politics. But what the Republican Party becomes is up to Republicans. And now perhaps, Donald Trump's success along the Rio Grande Valley and in South Florida, maybe that increased diversity takes the Republican Party in a different direction because they now have a more diverse constituency, or maybe that more diverse constituency becomes more accepting of the principles of the Trumpian Republican Party. I don't know the answer to those questions. All I can say really is that this is something that, liberals cannot force an identity crisis inside the Republican Party. It's something, political identity formation is something that is sort of a process internal to their coalition. But I do know that as long as the Republican Party can hold power, even with a minority of the vote, by engaging in this kind of Trumpian identity politics, they're going to keep doing that because that's just how politicians work. It's not a question of, necessarily right or wrong. It is a rational political choice. And unfortunately, it's one that's very dangerous for our democracy.
Yeah. Well, related to that, is it possible that we learn that cruelty is multiracial? Didn't Trump grow his share of Black and Hispanic voters? What do you think of that?
I mean, cruelty is a human trait. The book is focused on cruelty in politics, specifically how it's used to demonize certain groups and justify excluding them from the political process or depriving them of their constitutional rights. But it's not something that's limited to conservatives or Republicans or even white people. That's just not how human nature works. But I will say, like I said, you look at 1932. Franklin Roosevelt wins the Black vote in the North, stunning Republicans because they're asking themselves, how could you vote for the party of Jim Crow? And the answer is that, the Republican Party had largely abandoned Black voters after Reconstruction. And Roosevelt was at least offering an economic agenda that would appeal to them. And so, that did not turn James Eastland into Martin Luther King Jr. It did not change what the nature of the Democratic Party, at least not at that moment. But ultimately, those voters were able to wrest control of the party away from the Dixiecrats. But the fact that Trump improved his margins among voters of color in 2020, that's important. It's a challenge, political challenge for the Democratic Party, but it doesn't change what Trump stands for, what he said, or what he did.
Okay, we've got somebody who wants you to handicap things here. What probability would you give to a major crisis in the Republican Party by the midterms and chastising Trump for good?
I don't. If you want political strategy or political prognostication, I am the wrong person to ask. I can look at history and I can tell you, what happened in the past when we encountered certain situations. How I can use the map that historians have drawn for us to locate, where we are, but I cannot, I'm not capable of predicting the outcomes of elections, and I wouldn't even begin to try. What I will say is that typically the president's party loses seats in the midterms. There are a few exceptions to this. George Bush after 9/11, Bill Clinton in his second term after the impeachment backfired on Republicans, at least in the midterm, but obviously not in the subsequent presidential election when Clinton's successor was defeated. So, typically, voters turn against the president's party in the midterms, and the Democrats have very thin margins in both chambers. So it's conceivable they could lose both. Absent some very unusual events, I think you can assume that the Democrats are not going to have a great midterm. And that's going to be a problem because Republicans will take from that that they do not need to change course.
Well, that was a valiant try, Adam. I, too, am out of the prediction business in American politics. But with that said, one more kind of related question. Somebody says, I've heard it will take 40 years for the U.S. to recover from Trumpism. Do you agree with that?
It's a weird, I think that's a weird frame because I think what you have to remember is that America has only been a true multiracial democracy since 1965 in the Voting Rights Act. And so, we're not recovering from Trumpism. We are in the midst of a struggle about what American democracy is going to be. And that struggle predates Donald Trump. It was 2013 when John Roberts, struck down the Voting Rights Act because he decided racism was over, and subsequently saw a wave of laws across the states, justifying attempts to restrict the vote in the name of partisanship. And because the parties are racially polarized, you saw Republicans essentially targeting Black voters with these voting restrictions. So, the question about whether we're going to recover from Trumpism, I think, is the wrong one, because we're not, Trump was a manifestation of these pre-existing political trends, but he was not the creator of them. And so now that he's gone, that those structural issues have not vanished. And so I think, the question is really, are we going to continue to be a multiracial democracy with true political equality, or are we departing that ideal into something else?
We've got another one. You've argued that Trump supporters consider lots of people to be illegitimate as not real Americans. Is it plausible to believe that 70 plus million people who voted for him think that?
I actually think we need to distinguish between the marginal Trump voter, that is, someone who might have voted for him despite having misgivings about him, and the kind of people who show up at Trump rallies and wear hats and T-shirts with like obscenities or other kinds of things. The kind of people who really build their political identities around Donald Trump, and the kind of people who pick someone every 4 years to vote for. I think those are two very distinct varieties of Trump supporter. And when I talk, and when you look at the polls, a significant number of Republicans are bought in, and a significant number of Republicans do accept the outcome of the election. And I think, when I'm talking about Republicans seeing the Democratic vote and the Democratic constituencies as illegitimate, I think that is a majority of the Republican Party, but it is not everybody who voted for Donald Trump.
Got another question. How can pushing anti-vaccination misinformation be a winning strategy for Republicans?
I think we're in a very polarized environment. And in that kind of environment, party identity, partisan identity becomes very significant. And people find ways to rationalize, even if you're a Republican who believes in vaccines, who supports vaccination, who is not bought in to these conspiracy theories, that doesn't mean you're going to become a Democrat. People have strongly held principles, and their political identities are a big part of who they are. And so, maybe it's not a sound political strategy in terms of winning over converts, but in terms of will it cost the Republican Party tremendously politically, maybe, but I don't see the evidence of that yet.
What do you think that Speaker Pelosi should do regarding Kevin McCarthy's nominees to the January 6th commission? How does she keep them from continuing their story of the big lie?
I think that the Democrats should not accept anybody on the commission who either encouraged the insurrection of January 6th or voted against certification afterwards. There's no reason to put anybody on the commission who, supports the belief of the rioters that the election should have been overturned, and merely differs on the question of whether it should have been overturned by violence, or simply Mike Pence abusing his ceremonial role to somehow determine who the president of the United States should be. That's not acceptable.
I think you may get some Server 2022 write-in votes for that one. Do you see Trumpism growing as we enter the era of the climate refugees?
If by Trumpism you mean nativism, unfortunately, I think that's likely. It would be nice if what would happen if the public abandoned those people who lied to them about the severity of the climate crisis when the effects of the climate crisis become more and more visible in people's everyday lives. But I think what's more likely is the same people who have exploited the false scarcity that we are currently living in to demonize groups that are not politically powerful enough to respond are probably going to pursue that strategy. Because it has been a successful strategy, are going to pursue that strategy in earnest when it comes to the effects of climate change.
Another question. Somebody wants to know more about the future of Trump's America. They say, I'm terrified. Is there any reason to remain calm?
The answer here, the book is about some pretty dark chapters in American history. But it's also about this. I'm inspired by that. There are people who sacrificed a great deal to make the world a better place for their children and grandchildren, which is one of the reasons why I personally am here. And so I don't feel like, obviously things can feel very dark and overwhelming at times. But I feel like I owe it to the people who went through much harsher conditions in order to make my life possible, not to give in to despair. And I think that's one way to look at it. There are a lot of people who worked very hard to create a better world in situations that, and I can't speak to everybody, but in situations that were much worse than mine personally. So I can't, they didn't give into that despair. So I can't either.
Yeah. Somebody is wanting to know if you have read the recent article by The Guardian describing Putin's massive and successful efforts to put Trump in the White House.
I think we should be very skeptical of purported intelligence documents that seem to confirm our worst suspicions about anything. I don't know the story well enough to question it. But I will say that I think people should be very skeptical of any story that seems to tell you everything you might want to believe. I think what we already know is bad enough. The Russian government tried very hard to interfere in the 2016 election on Trump's behalf, and Trump welcomed that help and deflected blame from the Russian government when asked. I haven't seen any evidence that Donald Trump, was, acting at the behest of the Russian government. I think the evidence so far suggests that he is a short-sighted opportunist who will take help from anywhere because he has no scruples. I would be very skeptical of anything purporting to show more than that, that hasn't been completely validated by people who are in a position to do so.
Related to that, recent foreign influence in American elections has been extremely well documented. Does Adam have a solution?
I don't really have a solution. I mean, this is kind of a political problem. Like, foreign interference in American elections is already illegal. You can harden the election system against interference, and the government should do that. But in terms of foreign propaganda, that's a political and free speech problem that Americans are going to have to deal with on a political level themselves. There's no way to protect people from hearing things that are false. We have, free speech in this country. We have a First Amendment. And so, you can't, you can make people register as foreign agents. You can do that kind of thing. But on some level, the American people themselves have to be persuaded to make the right political decisions when confronted with foreign propaganda. It's not really a question that can be solved by the government.
Somebody else wants to know if you see a link to trends toward totalitarianism in other places in the world.
I think there's obviously a trend towards right-wing nationalism in other parts of the world. I don't know how successful ultimately it's going to be. I think one of the significant projects of the Biden administration should be reviving hope in American democracy, in part by showing that it can be responsive to the needs of regular people. Totalitarianism is different from mere authoritarianism. And I don't think we actually see a trend towards that. I think there is a trend towards democratic backsliding. But totalitarianism is an extreme form of authoritarian government that I think I do not see a trend towards that in particular. I think what we see is a kind of right-wing nationalism that is very dangerous, that is undemocratic. But I would distinguish between those two things.
Okay. Well, I'm going to ask you one last one, and that is really just about where you are. Talk about where you are at the end of the Trump presidency, not necessarily the Trump era, the Trump presidency. These essays that you wrote, the reporting and the writing that you've done. Where are you with what these past five plus years have meant? in terms of how you
I think
think about the country, how you think about covering this going forward?
I think in some ways I'm still covering the same story, which is, who does America want to be? But I also think, the ultimate meaning of the Trump administration is really still being written. How we view this chapter in history has not been determined yet. And to some extent, that determination will be made by the American people and the political decisions that they make in the next few years. The thing about public memory is that it's malleable. So how we think of Trump now may not be how people think of Trump in 5 years. And power has a way of manipulating public memory to justify itself. That was one of the fears I had in the beginning of the Trump administration, was that process was already beginning to take place. And you can see it in some sense with, things like the Capitol riot, for people trying to, call it, it called the people who were doing it tourists, or trying to minimize the violence or the intent of the rioters themselves, which was to overturn their election by their own words. So I think, where I am is that it's hard to know what significance this chapter in American history will have. I don't think we will know until a few years from now. That we're still writing it. We're still writing the story. Even though Trump is gone, his effect as a manifestation of these pre-existing political trends was tremendous. And it has put us on a particular course that I don't think we know where it's leading. And for that reason, the story is ongoing.
Yeah, well, I certainly feel like you have a clearer eyed view at the end of this. And I wonder if you feel like the political press in general is better equipped to cover this electorate going forward, to understand kind of where we are and where we're going from here.
I think if you look at, the coverage, there was a tremendous improvement, I think, in terms of political coverage in many outlets towards the end of the Trump administration. But I think, the tradition of nonpartisan objectivity in American journalism, and I want to be clear that I don't have a problem with actual objectivity, but the problem with political journalism is that it wants two parties that are on, that have policy disputes, but who are basically on the same plane as far as democracy is concerned. And the Republican Party's continued radicalization against democracy is a real challenge for the press, because how do you maintain that necessary neutrality in that kind of circumstance? And I don't, and I think, one way you can, and the trouble is that the only real way to do that is to minimize the threat or the level of radicalization against democracy that one of the parties is going through. You can either do that, or you can describe it accurately and be called a partisan and a liberal or a Democrat or, a propagandist. And that's a real challenge. I don't know, I think that I think that things are going to be pretty hard for American journalism going forward, not just financially, but in terms of figuring out how to write the story in a way that informs readers, but also does not soft pedal the perils that American democracy is facing.
Yeah. And you mentioned kind of where you see the story going from here for you. Can you talk about just kind of in the short term, what it is that you have your eye on in terms of our politics, what it is that you're drawn to in the moment?
I don't want to spoil anything, so I'm not going to answer that question, but I'm working on some things that I think y'all will find edifying.
Well, consider this my RSVP. I've already in my mind retweeted and shared whatever it is that you are working on. So I want to thank Adam Serwer, staff writer at The Atlantic and author of The Cruelty is the Point, The Past, the Present, and Future of Trump's America. And we encourage you to pick up your copy of Adam's new book at your local bookstore. If you'd like to watch more virtual programs or support the Commonwealth Club's efforts, please visit commonwealthclub.org. I'm Erin Haynes. Thank you all so much. Take care and have a good night.
Thank you so much, Aaron.